In the summer of 1966, three men, Miguel, José, Viana, Manoel, Pereira de Cruz, and Elcio Gomes, they were conducting an experiment on Atafona beach in Brazil. Witnesses watched in awe as a luminous object descended over the ocean, shot upwards, and then exploded in a massive fireball. The blast lit up the sky, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of sulphur. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard up to 10 miles away, shaking buildings in the nearby city of Campos dos Goitacazes. Simultaneously, fishermen reported seeing a UFO plunging into the sea. This event would set the stage for a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Fast forward a couple of months to August 18th, 1966. A young man called Paulo, he was hunting birds on Morro de Vintém, a hill in Niterói in Rio de Janeiro. Now, while he was there, he stumbled upon two men lying side by side. Unsure if they were sleeping, Paulo alerted a nearby guard, but the guard didn't do anything. He didn't investigate further. 2 days later, on August the 20th, an 18-year-old called Jorge, he was flying a kite on the same hill when he noticed a strong, unpleasant odour coming from the bodies. He informed the police, but due to the challenging terrain and fading daylight, making it difficult to climb up this hill, they didn't reach the scene until the next day. By then, the bodies had been exposed to the elements for over 3 days. The men were identified as 32-year-old Manoel Pereira de Cruz and 34-year-old Miguel José Viana, two of the men from the Atafona beach incident. They were friends and business partners from Campos dos Goitacazes. Manoel, he owned a shop for TV and radio components, while Miguel, he was an electronics enthusiast with a radio repair shop. The men were married with children and were, on the surface, ordinary, well-respected members of the community. However, the circumstances of their deaths were anything but ordinary. The scene was strange, to say the least. The two men, they were lying on their backs on a spread of pindoba leaves, which were thought to have been cut with a blade, but there was no knife found. There were no signs of a struggle, and the bodies showed no visible injuries. Strangely, the bodies hadn't been disturbed by animals, which only deepened the mystery, because how could two men die in such a way that even scavengers wouldn't touch them? The men were dressed in formal suits and identical raincoats. Nearby lay crudely cut homemade lead eye masks, shaped like glasses, but without any eye holes or stems to keep them on. The men were also carrying handwritten notes. Some of the pages contained alphanumeric codes, later determined to be part numbers for electronic components related to their work. But the other pages contained cryptic instructions that still baffle investigators to this day. One of the notes, when translated, read, Sunday, 1 capsule after lunch. Wednesday, 1 capsule at bedtime. Another note read, 16:30, be at the specified location. 18:30, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, await signal, mask. Just what specific location, presumably Vintém Hill, but what capsules, and protect what metals, And await what signal? It's all very, very mysterious. Miguel's brother later discovered that the paper the notes were written on had come from a notebook inside their shop in Campos, and a handwriting analysis showed that the instructions had been written by Miguel. But the police suspected that some of the terminology wasn't his, suggesting someone else may have dictated the notes to him. The men were carrying approximately 161,000 cruzeiro between them. The police found a receipt for the raincoats they were wearing and a ticket for a water bottle, which would enable them to return it for a small refund. Other items found near the bodies included 2 towels inside paper packets, square pieces of cellophane paper soaked in an unknown chemical substance, a handkerchief with the initials MAS, neither of their initials, cigarettes, a newspaper, and 2 cups that had been crudely made from a sheet of aluminium foil. Inside Miguel's pockets were a wedding ring tied to a pair of reading glasses and a wristwatch. One theory is that the men removed their jewellery to protect it, as per the instructions, protect metals. The bodies were taken to the coroner's office, but due to a backlog, an assistant prepared them for the autopsy. Unfortunately, the organs weren't properly stored, and by the time the coroner actually examined them, they had decomposed to the point where proper testing was impossible. A toxicology report was released, indicating no abnormalities, but it was almost certainly fabricated. No actual testing had been done. The autopsy report issued the following month stated, "Cause of death could not be determined because of the advanced state of decomposition on the bodies." This report was signed by the coroner, Astor Pereira de Melo. However, the specialist's name, Sebastião Falaci, he had been erased and replaced by the name Walmore Gianni. Speculation is that the specialist, Falaci, disagreed with the report and had his name removed from it. It's very, very strange. With no clues as to how the men died, the police were keen to establish their final movements and interviewed the men's families and acquaintances in Campos, as well as witnesses who had seen them in Niterói. The police established that the men had told their families they were headed to Sao Paulo, which is about 430 miles away, and they were going there with the intention of purchasing a car and supplies for their electronic business. So, on Wednesday, August the 17th, the 2 men took the 9 a.m. bus from Campos. However, instead of travelling to Sao Paulo, as they had told their families, they got off the bus at approximately 2 p.m. in the city of Niterói, 170 miles away. So they didn't take the 430-mile journey as they had said they were going to. They had supposedly taken with them about 3 million cruzeiro, which is a much larger sum than the 161,000 cruzeiro that was found on their bodies, presumably to purchase this car that they had said that they were going to go and purchase. When Miguel and Manoel arrived in Niterói, they first stopped at an electronics store called Fluscop, where they talked to the owner about purchasing some components that were not in stock. Now, the owner found this conversation a bit strange because, given the men's level of expertise, they should have realised that the components they needed would not have been found there. They left the shop without purchasing anything. It was beginning to rain when the men had arrived in Niterói, and the receipts in the men's pockets show that their next stop was at a clothing store where they purchased matching raincoats for 9,400 cruzeiro each. However, the clerk said that the men left in such a hurry that they didn't even bother to put the raincoats on before heading out into the rain. Next, the 2 men walked to a bar and they bought a bottle of mineral water, which was later found almost empty at the scene. Police questioned the waitress at the bar, who told them the men seemed agitated, particularly Miguel, who was constantly looking at his watch and appeared worried about missing something important. Remember the timings on this note. Despite appearing to be in a hurry, the men waited for the receipt so that they could then later return the glass bottle to the bar for a small refund. So they were intending to return to the bar and return the glass bottle. The men left the bar at approximately 3:15 p.m. Now, what happened next is unclear. It's unknown whether the men's apparent agitation that day was because the timings on the note required them to be at a specified location by 4:30, or if they were planning to meet someone. According to one account, the men set out for Vintém Hill on foot. In a different account, a guard reported seeing the men being dropped off at the base of the hill by a jeep containing 3 other unidentified individuals. No one knows exactly what happened after the men left the bar. But whether they left on foot or were driven, it's believed that they reached the top of the hill at around about 4:30 p.m, the rendezvous time according to the note. They were following a strict schedule. But why? Shortly after the discovery of the men's bodies, Elcio Gomes, the third man at Atafona beach, he was brought in for questioning. Manoel's widow had told the police that she had witnessed an argument between her husband and Gomes, making him a suspect. However, Gomes was able to provide the police with an alibi regarding his whereabouts at the time of his friend's deaths, and he also provided a receipt for vehicle parts he had purchased in Campos that day. His neighbours also reported seeing him working on his car at home during the time the men were believed to have died. However, despite the strong alibi, it did seem that Gomes was hiding something. In September 1966, Gomes informed the police about a man named Alvarez de Souza, who was subsequently arrested. No action was taken against this man, though it raised questions about whether Gomes was genuinely being helpful and offering names of potential suspects, or was he trying to divert suspicion away from himself. When he was questioned about the Atafona beach incident, he provided conflicting accounts. He first stated that the men had travelled there in Miguel's car, and later claimed that Miguel's car was broken and they had used his car instead. Furthermore, an employee of Miguel and Manoel alleged that Gomes had lied to the police when he told them that Miguel and Manoel were the masterminds behind the incident, because it was actually Gomes who had instigated the experiment. The employee also said that Gomes acted as a spiritual doctor, greatly influencing Miguel and Manoel, who would consult him for their physical ailments. This raised the possibility that Gomes may have prescribed the capsules the men had taken that day and may account for his conflicting testimony. Anyway, no further action was taken against Gomes, but it was evident that he was influential in the spiritual beliefs of Miguel and Manoel, because both Miguel and Manoel were members of a spiritualist group, and Gomes was also a part of this same group. So this group was a group of spiritual scientists. Gomes was questioned about the group and confirmed that the men were part of a secret society of experienced electrical technicians who practiced spiritism. Spiritism is hugely popular in Brazil. It's a belief system based on the idea that every person has an immortal spirit or soul that's linked to their physical body. And when we die, the spirit is released and then reincarnated. Spiritism began in the 1850s by a French writer called Allan Kardec. He was also a scientist and a medical doctor. At the time, he attended seances and witnessed phenomena that he couldn't explain or dismiss as fake. And as we know, back then, and arguably now as well, there were plenty of frauds pretending to be clairvoyants. So as a scientist, Kardec, he made it his mission to investigate and find evidence to separate the fact from the fiction in spiritual phenomena. So, while Spiritism might sound very similar to other religions or philosophies that also believe in the soul and reincarnation, Spiritists approach the spirit world in a more scientific way. Unlike traditional mystical practices, they lean on methods that aim to be more grounded in observation and study. And it's this blend of belief, curiosity, and a desire to understand the unexplained that makes Spiritism attractive, particularly among the more technical and scientifically minded, i.e., a couple of electronics enthusiasts like Miguel and Manoel. However, it appeared Miguel and Manoel's beliefs extended to a desire to communicate with beings on Mars, because Spiritists believe there is life on other planets, and where there's life, there's also a spirit. So these men, they were creating experiments to communicate with the spiritual world, whether it be human spirit or alien spirit. But their experiments went beyond traditional ghost hunting or seance-style investigations, but towards more scientific approaches. Gomes explained that Manuel's backyard had been used to perform first contact rituals, and that 2 months before their deaths, they had built a device in an attempt to establish such contact, and this device then exploded. Now, this was actually confirmed by Manuel's father. The police found evidence supporting Gomes' claims when they raided Manuel's home workshop, including tools, lead scraps for making the masks, and a book on scientific spiritualism. One highlighted passage discussed an intense luminosity emitted from the creatures which could blind humans, thus explaining the men's belief that lead masks were necessary for eye protection. The police couldn't dismiss the possibility that Miguel and Manuel had visited Vintém Hill that day to conduct another one of their experiments. To lend credence to this, it appears Gomes was not the last person to see the men before they boarded the bus to Niterói. In fact, Miguel and Manuel had run into Miguel's cousin, who expressed scepticism about their claim of a 5-hour bus trip to purchase a used car. Miguel himself confirmed they had told people the car and electronics purchase was a cover for their real intentions. As he said to his cousin, "Buying a car isn't the real purpose of this trip. When I get back, I'll tell you whether or not I believe in spiritualism." On August the 25th, 1966, a new witness came forward who corroborated the theory the police were now investigating, that the men had travelled to Vintém Hill to make contact with extraterrestrials. The witness was Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza, who stated that on the evening of August 17th, the night that Miguel and Manuel arrived in Niterói, she and her 3 children, they were driving home when they saw a UFO hovering over Vintém Hill. Gracinda described it as an orange oval shape with a ring of fire around its edges, emitting blue rays of light in all directions. Given Gracinda's high standing in society, her account of the incident was deemed credible. The local newspapers covered the sighting, and soon after, other residents soon came forward claiming they had also seen the same object. In fact, Vintém Hill seemed to be an alien hotspot. A couple of years later, someone claimed to have taken a photo of an unidentified object hovering above the hill. At the time, UFO sightings, they were being reported frequently, and some people believed that the sightings over Vintém Hill were evidence that Miguel and Manuel had been attempting to make contact with extraterrestrials that evening. In fact, the police believed that Miguel and Manuel had conducted similar experiments in other cities, with the explosion in Atafona Beach actually drawing the attention of the Navy, who were interested in the men's connection to supposed alien sightings and whether they posed a threat to national security. On the evening before the explosion, the Navy's monitoring system had detected a conversation between 3 unidentified ham radio stations. Upon checking the logs, they found that these 3 stations were not officially registered to anyone in Brazil. According to Gomes, Miguel and Manoel operated a secret radio station, so one of the signals could have been from them, although the other 2 signals remain a mystery. But whoever was responsible for those other 2 signals must have also been involved in the experiments. So these experiments extended further than Miguel and Manuel's backyards. Four years earlier, in 1962, another electronics technician was discovered dead in similar circumstances. Hermes Luis Filtosa. He was found on Cruzeiro Hill near Neves, and like Miguel and Manoel, a homemade lead mask was lying beside him. It seems likely that all the men were part of the same society. In fact, Gomes claimed that Miguel and Manoel had maintained a secret radio communication centre in their hometown to stay in contact with other members around the country. The police reopened the case of Hermes Luis Feitosa, but they weren't able to find any connection to Miguel and Manoel. And there was no explanation still for Hermes' death, though it is believed he took drugs, convinced that he could receive radio and television signals with his mind. I mean, they couldn't link it, but it's all very following the same patterns, right? Now look, it's pure speculation that Miguel and Manoel were on Vintém Hill because of aliens. But historically, there are strange cases involving UFOs and unexplained disappearances or mysterious circumstances. Take Carl Hunrath and Wilbur Wilkinson, for example. Back in 1953, these 2 electrical engineers vanished under bizarre circumstances. They were deeply involved in the UFO movement at the time, believing they could make contact with extraterrestrials. In fact, Hunrath claimed to have developed a device designed to attract UFOs. On November the 11th, they rented a small plane from Los Angeles and set off to find a UFO that, according to them, had landed nearby. They didn't file a flight plan, and neither they nor the plane was ever seen again. Some people speculate they fell victim to a tragic crash, most likely. Others think they were abducted by aliens. I mean, think of Heaven's Gate, large groups of people who have built their entire belief system around UFOs, combining extraterrestrial phenomenon with spiritual or religious beliefs. Heaven's Gate was founded in 1974 and believed that followers could become immortal extraterrestrial beings by giving up their human nature. They called this transformation the next level. In 1997, 39 members tragically took their own lives, thinking their spirits would board a spaceship following their Hale-Bopp comet. Now, I'm not suggesting these cases are linked, but these external cases highlight humanity's enduring fascination with extraterrestrial life. Miguel and Manoel, like many others throughout history, may have been captivated by the mysteries of the cosmos and driven by a desire to connect with something beyond our world, but through a scientific approach that sought evidence of the unexplainable. But it's a theory. It's just a theory. Of course, there are more human explanations as to why the 2 men were on the hill that day. So it is known that the men had notes with instructions for taking capsules. But unfortunately, without a toxology report, it can never be determined if or what they consumed. Frustratingly, the results of testing on the square pieces of paper soaked in that unknown chemical substance, those results are also unknown. However, the evidence, such as the notes, the makeshift cups, the nearly empty water bottle, and the connection to Hermes Luis Fitosa, the electronics technician discovered dead 4 years earlier and who it's believed used drugs on the day he died, all these things strongly suggest that Miguel and Manoel had taken a substance on the day they died. This is backed up by other accounts. About 10 days after the men's death, a Brazilian newspaper published a statement from a yoga teacher suggesting that Miguel and Manoel may have been using mind-altering drugs like LSD to enhance their mental alertness during their telepathic experiments. Similarly, Father Oscar Gonzalez Quevedo, a professor of parapsychology, he told another newspaper that the drugs Miguel and Manoel used were meant to induce a trance state, allowing them to enter a higher level of consciousness. He also confirmed that the light emissions they would receive while in this trance state were very powerful, and that the lead masks found by the bodies, they were used in these occult practices to provide some protection from the bright light. Additionally, in his statement to the police, Gomes also stated that the men would use drugs when performing their rituals. However, even with this knowledge, even though it is likely that they did take some kind of substance, questions still remain unanswered. For instance, psychedelic drugs like LSD are not known to cause accidental overdose. Of course, they could have been from a bad batch, but the odds of Hermes Luis Fitosa also dying from a bad batch 4 years earlier seem low. Another theory suggests that the men overdosed intentionally. Their goal could have been to shed their physical bodies and be transported to the alien world, which, considering their spiritual beliefs, is plausible. Think Heaven's Gate. They all kind of did a similar thing. It's plausible. But the problem with this theory is their behaviour leading up to their deaths did not really indicate suicidal intentions. Number one, their families did not notice any unusual behaviour from them before they died, although families often don't, so. But number two, they planned on returning that water bottle to the bar. The waitress said that they hung around specifically for the receipt, so it seems that they were planning to return. So, they might have intended to commit suicide, but it just doesn't look likely. Lastly, it's possible that the capsules that they took, whatever they took, could they have been tampered with? And if they had been tampered with, that means the men were deliberately murdered. But if that's the case, who would have wanted to murder them? And for what reason? So some people speculate that Miguel and Manoel had gone to Vintém Hill to purchase smuggled illegal goods for their work. At the time, Brazil was grappling with inflation and economic instability, and the military government had implemented measures to reduce reliance on foreign products by promoting domestic production. As a result, imported goods may have been more expensive and less accessible compared to locally made items. Alternatively, another theory suggests that Miguel and Manoel were trying to obtain radioactive materials for their experimental devices. Some believe the masks were intended to protect themselves from radiation exposure. In 1980, Jacques Vallée, he was an expert in UFO phenomena, and he visited the area to investigate the case. In his book, Confrontations, A Scientist's Search for Alien Contact, he noted that the sparse vegetation where the bodies were found could have indicated the presence of radiation. However, another explanation for the fact that the grass didn't fully grow back is that it may have been due to the chemicals used on the ground where the decomposing bodies were discovered. Arguably, if Miguel and Manoel were handling radioactive material, they probably would have taken better protection and covered more of their body than just their eyes. Additionally, the Army's analysis of the masks found no traces of radioactive substances. One possibility is that the men were simply there to meet someone to purchase radioactive material, but were murdered instead. But again, why were they murdered? Alternatively, some people believe that the men were tricked into taking what they thought were anti-radiation tablets so that they could safely inspect radioactive material, but were poisoned instead. Regardless of whether Miguel and Manoel had travelled to Niterói that day to purchase illicit or radioactive material, the question still remains: why on earth would someone want to murder them? Which brings us back to the question of money. These things usually do come back to money. Could Miguel and Manoel have been murdered because of the large sum of cash they were carrying? Had they been lured to the area, believing they were purchasing hard-to-come-by goods for their work, or radioactive materials for their experiments? Had the men's trust been gained before being lured to the location and robbed? When the police returned to the scene of where they were found on Vintém Hill a few days later, they found a stone post on the ground, which they believed could have been used as a marker for a meeting at the site. However, Miguel and Manoel, they were intelligent men, and it seems questionable that they would have fallen for such a ruse. Additionally, was it even likely that someone would go to so much effort to rob them? The men were supposedly carrying 3 million cruzeiro, which sounds like a huge sum of money, but that was actually around about 2,000 US dollars in today's currency. The 161,000 cruzeiro that was left and found on their bodies would be the equivalent of around about 100 US dollars today. Given the effects of inflation, it's difficult to determine the exact equivalent values, but these figures provide a rough sense of the situation by today's standards. Therefore, if we consider the stolen amount to be just a couple of $1,000s, can robbery still be viewed as a compelling motive? Yes, if it was opportunistic. But it seems like a lot of effort to set up a fake story to lure two intelligent men to a hilltop to murder them for, not a small sum of money, but comparatively a relatively small sum of money. Of course, we need to remember there was a 3-day period where the men's bodies lay undiscovered on that hillside. We already know the 2 boys who stumbled across the men before the police arrived, as well as the guard who didn't investigate any further. Very, very odd. Therefore, there would have been ample time for somebody, the boys, the guard, anybody else who stumbled across their bodies to take that money. If somebody came across the bodies and was hastily rummaging through the dead men's pockets, it's reasonable to assume that that small amount that was left and remaining got overlooked, and whoever was doing it were just in a haste to get away and left a little bit of cash behind. So it is plausible that this was opportunistic. And it might also explain why the men's jewellery was left behind, because organised robbers, they probably would have taken all their valuables as well. The case went relatively quiet for about a year, with no significant advancements made by the police. Unhappy with the outcome of the police investigation, the Justice Department ordered a new investigation. And on the 25th of August 1967, the bodies of Miguel and Manoel were exhumed from Caju Cemetery in Campos. However, a toxicology report still couldn't be performed, and the cause of death still remains unknown. The following year, in 1968, a further attempt to establish a cause of death was made when bones and tissues were sent to the Institute of Atomic Energy in Sao Paulo. A neutron activation analysis was carried out on the men's hair follicles, testing for arsenic, mercury, barium, and thallium. Now, the reason for this testing, so barium, that can affect heart rhythms when exposure occurs, potentially causing irregularities or even dangerous arrhythmias. Thallium is often associated with poisoning and historically used in rat poison. Its presence might raise suspicions of intentional poisoning or accidental exposure. Basically, these tests would help point towards either murder, suicide, or accidental poisoning during the experiments. However, all were found to be at normal levels. This ruled out poisoning from common toxic substances, but it didn't bring investigators any closer to solving the mystery. By this stage of the investigation, the police believed Miguel and Manoel had been murdered and their bodies dumped on the hill. In August 1967, the police were looking for a car they believed to be involved. We don't know whether, when leaving the bar, they walked to the hill, or some witnesses claim to have seen them in a jeep with 3 unidentified people. So this seems to be the route that the police are going down. In February 1969, the case took another dramatic turn when newspapers began reporting that the case was solved and the police had named the suspect they had for the men's murder. The police named a smuggler called Hamilton Bizani, who had confessed to his involvement in the murders of Miguel and Manoel. When the police had interviewed Hamilton earlier that year, he was already in prison, serving a 50-year sentence for smuggling. Hamilton told the police that while on the run, he had been hiding in a safe house in Rio when 3 associates contacted him and offered him a hit job in Niterói with enough money to tide him over for the next few months in hiding. He accepted this hit. The gang then drove in a stolen car to a spiritualist centre where the manager, Helena, was holding a séance. There, they met their targets, Miguel and Manoel, and learned that the 2 men had a large sum of money on them. After the séance, Hamilton drove the gang, along with Miguel and Manoel, to Vintém Hill, where they forced the 2 men to ingest poison at gunpoint and stole their money. In some accounts, Helena was the one who hired the hit, while according to one of the newspapers, Hamilton claimed that Miguel and Manoel had installed communication equipment on ships used by the 3 men for smuggling, and they had to be silenced. However, this is all Hamilton's story, obviously, and his story was riddled with contradictions, and the police dismissed it. It seemed that Hamilton's true intention was to make a deal and get transferred to a prison in Niterói where escape was apparently easier. He was sent back to prison and sued for giving false testimony. However, what is interesting from this fake confession is the questions it raises, because were Miguel and Manoel dropped off at the base of the hill by a jeep containing unidentified individuals? Obviously not Hamilton and his gang, but were there other people involved? And also the other question is, had the men visited the spiritualist centre before reaching their destination at Vintém Hill? I mean, it makes sense. We know that that's what they were into. If they left the bar around about 3:15, got to the hill around about 4:30, was that enough time to visit a spiritualist centre along the way? We don't know. So to this day, we just don't know what happened to Miguel and Manoel. Did they die from an accidental overdose during a spiritual experiment? Were they murdered for the money they were carrying? Or did they succeed in making contact with extraterrestrials? Had Gracinda de Souza actually seen an aircraft that night? And Miguel and Manoel were successful when they made contact and they left their bodies behind. I mean, that is definitely a nicer idea than they were murdered, right? Personally, I don't believe the men were murdered. It does seem like a lot of effort to send them so far away and get them up a hill. You know, it just seems like a lot of effort. If the intention was to rob them, I don't think the perpetrators would have gone to that much trouble of getting them up the hill to do so. And if the men had been followed and then robbed, there likely would have been more obvious signs of a struggle, because don't forget, there was no signs of a struggle either. Instead, to me, it seems like whoever robbed them did so more out of opportunity rather than planning this whole ruse to get them up a hill. Of course, this is even assuming the men had the money by this point. I mean, if they left their home with all that money, it doesn't mean they necessarily still had that money at the top of that hill. We just don't know. I also dismiss many of the other strange theories, such as them being lovers who committed suicide. I mean, what the hell is that about? They were electrocuted. I mean, there were no signs of any equipment. There's no evidence whatsoever to support any of these theories. One of the absolutely strangest theories I've heard, though, is that Miguel and Manoel did make contact with aliens that night, but that the aliens also carried out a revenge attack on the men as retribution for obliterating their friend over Atafona Beach. Because don't forget, witnesses said they saw this alien spaceship dropping into the sea. So the theory goes that the aliens got revenge on Miguel and Manoel for obliterating their friend over Atafona Beach. I mean, I don't know. I don't buy it personally. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I don't buy it. In my opinion, it was a tragic accident with no malicious intent. Miguel and Manoel were individuals dedicated to their beliefs, and they had travelled to a location known for UFO activity to conduct one of their experiments. They took psychedelic drugs to reach a higher consciousness, and they had their masks ready for the powerful light emissions they would receive while in a trance state. However, as electronics technicians rather than scientists, they, or whoever provided the drugs and dosage, may have miscalculated the quantities they were using. Unfortunately, this case was a mess from the beginning, and it's doubtful that we're ever going to know the truth. If only a toxology report had been conducted from the start, then we wouldn't be as in the dark as Miguel and Manoel were when they put on those masks. Thanks for joining me on this journey into a rather strange and unusual true crime case. If you have any theories about the lead masks case, I'd love to hear them. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring. You look after yourselves, you look after your loved ones, press the like button, and keep an eye on them skies. Bye.